Ma'am, what are you doing here at this hour?
Getting gas. Am I being detained, officer?
You match a suspicious profile. Place your hands on the vehicle now.
There's no legal basis for that. Please check my identification.
Imagine for a moment the sheer unpredictability of power dynamics in our society. What happens when the person you unjustly strip of their dignity in the dead of night is the exact same person holding the gavel over your career the very next morning? It sounds like the plot of a Hollywood thriller, but sometimes reality writes a script far more compelling than fiction. This is a story about the devastating cost of assumptions, the heavy burden of duty, and how the scales of justice can sometimes balance themselves in the most unexpected ways. Before we dive into the events that unfolded in a quiet, chilling parking lot and culminated in a federal courtroom, ask yourself this: how often do our snap judgments blind us to the truth standing right in front of us? If you believe that accountability is the cornerstone of a fair society, go ahead and hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments where you are watching from today. Your engagement helps us bring these vital stories to light. Now let us unravel the extraordinary 48 hours that forever changed a county's legal landscape, beginning with a woman who had just endured the most agonizing heartbreak of her life. Judge Elena Vance was a woman defined by her unshakable composure. At 48 years old, she had dedicated nearly 2 decades to the federal bench, navigating the complex labyrinths of constitutional law with a sharp mind and an even temper. She was known for demanding excellence from prosecutors and defense attorneys alike, never allowing emotion to cloud her interpretation of the statute. But on a bitterly cold November morning, at exactly 2 o'clock, the law felt entirely irrelevant. The sterile, unforgiving hum of the intensive care unit had been her world for the past 24 hours. Elena sat beside a mechanical bed, watching the monitors that tracked her mother's fading heartbeat. Clara Vance had been a pillar of her community, a woman who had scrubbed floors and worked double shifts to ensure her daughter could afford law school. She was the immovable force that had taught Elena the value of fairness in a world that often relied on flawed biases. Now cancer was claiming that force. The attending physician had quietly explained that the transition was imminent, leaving Elena in that unbearable purgatory of waiting for the end. She had rushed to the hospital straight from a weekend retreat, completely out of her usual immaculate attire. Her hair was pulled back loosely and she wore faded sweatpants and an oversized college hoodie. There was no trace of the formidable magistrate who routinely commanded respect in the courtroom. When she finally tore herself away from the bedside to grab a change of clothes from her home, she was running on nothing but adrenaline, grief, and the bitter dregs of hospital coffee. Driving her sedan down the deserted interstate, the fuel indicator suddenly illuminated the dashboard, a harsh yellow warning in the pitch-black cabin. She took the next available exit, guiding her vehicle into the harsh, flickering fluorescent glow of a 24-hour convenience store. The air outside was biting, smelling of exhaust and impending snow. As she stepped out to operate the pump, her mind remained tethered to the rhythmic, failing beeps of her mother's heart monitor. She barely noticed the headlights sweeping across the empty asphalt until a patrol cruiser pulled up sharply behind her, its angled position deliberately blocking her from leaving. 2 officers emerged from the vehicle. Deputy Miller, a veteran with a rigid posture and a weary expression, took the lead, while his younger partner, Deputy Collins, hovered near the rear quarter panel, his hand resting instinctively near his utility belt. Miller approached with his heavy flashlight raised, the blinding beam cutting through the darkness and hitting Elena directly in the eyes. She raised a hand to block the glare, her exhaustion momentarily replaced by confusion. She was fully aware of her rights. She knew the parameters of a lawful stop, the necessity of reasonable, articulable suspicion, and the constitutional protections afforded to every citizen. When Miller demanded to know what she was doing in that specific neighborhood at such a late hour, relying on vague assumptions rather than a specific legal violation, Elena remained completely calm. She did not raise her voice. She did not argue aggressively. Instead, she reached slowly and deliberately into her bag, pulling out her leather-bound federal credentials. She held out the laminated identification, the gold seal catching the ambient light. She identified herself clearly as a federal magistrate, offering the contact information for the clerk's office for immediate verification. What happened next was a profound failure of judgment. Deputy Miller briefly illuminated the credentials, then looked at Elena's exhausted face, her baggy clothes, her unstyled hair. His preconceived notions overrode the physical evidence in his hand. He scoffed, a dismissive sound that echoed in the quiet night, and turned to his partner. To them, the idea that a woman fitting Elena's description, dressed in sweatpants at a gas station in the early hours of the morning, could hold one of the highest legal positions in the district was entirely unbelievable. Their bias blinded them to the reality of the situation. Ignoring her identification, ignoring her calm assertion of her Fourth Amendment rights, Miller ordered her to place her hands on the hood of the vehicle. When Elena calmly stated that there was no legal basis for a detention, the situation escalated with terrifying speed. The officers interpreted her assertion of constitutional rights as resistance. Within moments, the cold, heavy steel of handcuffs was ratcheted tightly around her wrists, the metal digging painfully into her skin. She was patted down, humiliated under the unforgiving security cameras of the canopy, and placed into the back of the cruiser. The holding cell at the county detention center was exactly as she had seen it described in countless civil rights lawsuits she had presided over. It was a concrete box that smelled of dampness and despair. The overhead lights hummed with a maddening frequency. She sat on the metal bench, her wrists bruised, her heart pounding not with fear, but with a deep, crushing sorrow. It was in that cell, stripped of her shoelaces and her dignity, that a weary corrections officer handed her a receiver through the bars. It was the hospital. The voice of the charge nurse was gentle, full of practiced sympathy, but the words struck Elena like a physical blow. Her mother, Clara, had passed away. Elena leaned her forehead against the cold cinder-block wall. She had missed the final moments of the woman who had sacrificed everything for her, all because of a profound misjudgment by those sworn to protect the public. By the time her credentials were finally processed and verified by a panicked shift supervisor hours later, the damage was done. She was released into the freezing dawn without an apology, handed her belongings in a clear plastic bag. She walked to an impound lot, paid the exorbitant fee to retrieve her vehicle, and drove home to an empty house. But the universe, or perhaps the rigid machinery of the judicial system, has a unique way of balancing its ledgers. Less than 24 hours later, Elena's phone rang. It was the chief judge of the district. An emergency had arisen. A colleague had fallen severely ill, and a highly publicized civil rights docket was set to begin that very morning at the county courthouse. It was an excessive force and false arrest claim, a case that had drawn intense media scrutiny and community interest. Elena was the only magistrate available to step in and preside over the proceedings. Despite her profound grief, her sense of duty was absolute. She agreed to take the bench. When Judge Elena Vance walked into the courtroom, the transformation was absolute. The sweatpants and exhaustion were gone, replaced by the imposing, sweeping black robe of federal authority. Her hair was pinned perfectly. Her expression was an impenetrable mask of absolute legal objectivity. The gallery was packed to capacity. Reporters had their notepads ready. Before the jury was brought in, she addressed the court to fulfill her ethical obligations. Her voice, calm and carrying the undeniable weight of authority, filled the cavernous room. She disclosed for the record that roughly 36 hours prior, she had been subjected to an unlawful detention and arrest by the very defendants named in the civil suit. The courtroom erupted into a chaotic murmur. The press scrambled for their devices, but Elena raised a hand commanding instant silence. She cited rigorous legal precedents explaining that a judge's personal experiences do not automatically necessitate recusal, provided they can maintain absolute impartiality and apply the law strictly to the evidence presented. She invited the defense to file a formal motion if they wished, which she systematically and legally denied on solid procedural grounds. Then the side doors swung open. Deputies Miller and Collins walked in, dressed in their Class A uniforms, their brass polished to a high shine. They walked with the quiet confidence of men who fully expected the system to protect them, just as it always had. They approached the defense table, pulling out their chairs, and then they looked up at the bench. The blood vanished from Miller's face. Collins froze, his hand trembling as it hovered over his chair. The realization hit them with the force of a physical impact. The woman staring down at them, the woman holding absolute authority over the admissibility of evidence and the conduct of their trial, was the exact same woman they had mocked, handcuffed, and caged while her mother drew her final breath. Elena did not glare. She did not smile. She simply looked at them with the neutral, assessing gaze of a seasoned jurist. "Counsel," she stated evenly, "call your first witness." The plaintiff's attorney, a brilliant litigator named Marcus Thorne, methodically dismantled the officer's defense. The case centered around a young, hard-working college student who had been subjected to a traffic stop for an allegedly broken taillight, a stop that escalated violently due to the officer's unwarranted assumptions about his demeanor. Thorne presented the dashcam footage. It showed a textbook, compliant citizen who kept his hands visible and answered questions politely. Yet the footage captured Deputy Miller operating on sheer bias, misjudging the young man's nervousness as a threat, escalating the encounter until the student was pinned to the asphalt, sustaining a concussion and fractured ribs. The turning point of the trial, however, was a piece of evidence that mirrored Elena's own horrific night. Thorne introduced newly recovered, unedited body camera footage that the department had previously claimed was corrupted. It not only captured the excessive force used against the student, but also recorded a conversation between Miller and Collins immediately after the arrest. In that audio, the officers candidly discussed relying on gut feelings based on a person's appearance and the neighborhood they were driving through, openly admitting to a pattern of making stops based on demographic assumptions rather than concrete legal infractions. The courtroom was breathless as Thorne cross-examined Deputy Miller. He systematically cornered the veteran officer, forcing him to explain the discrepancies between his written report and the video evidence. Miller's confident facade crumbled. He stammered, attempting to rely on the vague defenses of officer safety and split-second decision-making. But the footage contradicted every word. Thorne brilliantly connected the dots, demonstrating a systemic culture where constitutional rights were routinely bypassed in favor of snap judgments and ingrained bias. When Thorne asked Miller if it was standard practice to ignore official identification when a suspect didn't look the part, the silence in the courtroom was deafening. Every eye flicked from the sweating deputy on the witness stand to the stoic, black-robed judge overseeing the trial. Miller's gaze dropped to the floor. The profound misjudgment he had exhibited in that gas station parking lot was not an isolated incident. It was his standard operating procedure. In her closing arguments, the plaintiff's attorney didn't just ask for compensation, she asked for a reckoning. She spoke eloquently about the Fourth Amendment, about the fundamental right of every citizen to go about their lives free from unreasonable searches and unfounded suspicions. She reminded the jury that justice is only blind to prejudice, not to the facts. When the jury returned, it took them less than 3 hours to reach a unanimous verdict. They found the deputies fully liable for false arrest, excessive force, and severe civil rights violations, awarding substantial punitive damages that sent a shockwave through the county's municipal leadership. But the true victory happened after the gavel fell. In her final ruling regarding the injunctive relief requested in the lawsuit, Judge Elena Vance issued a comprehensive mandate. She ordered the implementation of an independent civilian oversight committee with full subpoena power. She mandated rigorous, continuous training focused on constitutional law and the dismantling of implicit bias. She required the immediate upgrading of all department recording equipment to tamper-proof systems with mandatory compliance audits. She used the power of the bench not for personal vengeance, but to ensure that the systemic failures that had robbed her of her final moments with her mother and had brutalized a young college student would be systematically dismantled. Months later, the department had entirely transformed its leadership. Deputies Miller and Collins were no longer wearing badges, having been terminated and facing their own subsequent federal inquiries. The culture of the county began to slowly, painfully shift toward genuine accountability and respect for the constitutional rights of all its citizens. One evening, driving home from the courthouse, Elena pulled into a cemetery on the outskirts of town. The snow had melted, and the early signs of spring were pushing through the cold earth. She walked to a simple, elegant headstone and laid a bouquet of fresh flowers against the granite. She stood there in the quiet twilight, the heavy burden of her grief finally making space for a profound sense of peace. She had honored her mother's legacy not through anger, but through the precise, unwavering application of the law. This story serves as a powerful reminder that true justice isn't just a concept debated in law schools. It is a daily practice. It requires vigilance, it requires courage, and it requires us to constantly challenge the assumptions that cloud our judgment. The moment we allow bias to dictate our actions, we compromise the very foundation of the society we claim to protect. If this story resonated with you, please take a second to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you never miss out on these deep dives into the legal battles that shape our world. Drop a comment below and tell me, do you think civilian oversight committees are the key to preventing these kinds of systemic failures? I read every single comment, and I'd love to hear your perspective. Until next time, stay informed, stay vigilant, and remember that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it only bends toward justice if we force it to. See you in the next video.